I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am very excited to be talking with Kailee Pedersen about Sacrificial Animals. This is her debut book, and it is atmospheric and gothic and frightening. There's some crazy family stuff. There is so much incredible nature. Basically, there's something for everyone in this book, so I'm very excited to get to talk about it today. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jenna. I'm really excited to chat more.
So this book has so much in it, and there are so many twists and turns, and we're going to keep it very spoiler-free for people because this is a book that you do not want to know how it ends when you go in at the very beginning. But I would just love for you to set up sort of this book and these characters for us.
Yeah, so the book primarily focuses on a Midwestern family, the Morrows, who live on a 1,000-acre farm called Stag's Crossing in rural Nebraska. The main character is Nick Morrow. He is the second son of the family, his older brother Joshua, and then his sort of domineering patriarchal father, Carlisle, who essentially runs the family with an iron fist. Prior to the events of the novel, Nick's mother unfortunately died in childbirth, giving birth to the third son of the family. And when the novel begins, the novel actually sort of toggles between Nick's childhood, his rememberings being around 13 and 14, and then also his adulthood, which takes place in the sort of quote unquote present timeline in his 40s. So in his 40s, Nick has sort of left the farm. He's now working as a literary critic on the East Coast. He's left a lot of Nebraska behind. And he gets a call from his father, Carlisle, and Carlisle says that he's dying of bone cancer. Sort of in a last-ditch attempt at a deathbed reconciliation with the sons that he has abused over the last decades, he invites Nick back to the family manse, the 1,000-acre farm, to bring the family back together. And what surprises Nick most of all about that invitation is that Carlisle has also invited Joshua. So Joshua was the first son of the family, sort of the blonde, blue-eyed, heir apparent, Carlisle's clear favorite. About 20 years before, Joshua fell in love with an Asian woman, married her, and got disowned over it. So Carlisle has not only invited sort of the prodigal son back, but also he invites Joshua's wife, Amelia. So when they come back to the farm, let's just say many old secrets, family tensions, messy family ties start to emerge. There is a lot of tension between the brothers, the sons and the father, and then also between, rather tantalizingly, Amelia and Nick himself. And that sort of starts to develop into something very, very destructive.
And if that at all intrigues you, I'm like, please pick up this book because there's that and so much more. There were several times that I thought I knew where the story was going and was like, oh, wait, 3 pages later, I have a completely different perspective and idea. And I love this back and forth between the past and the present and sort of getting to unfold all of these things as we go through. Did you know the entire time as you were writing that this needed to be told in those dual timelines?
No, I tend to write pretty much by the seat of my pants. I'm definitely the type of writer that just kind of opens Word and just sees what's going to happen. So I started with the first chapter, and then I started to realize I needed to also address Nick's adulthood. And I felt like this kind of dual chapter structure made sense to me, toggling back and forth, because it represents Nick's psyche. There are some elements of his childhood that I think he has sort of separated from his adult self due to trauma, due to the violence in his family, and also due to some aspects of, I'll just say there's a bit of a queer awakening that happens for him. And I think that sort of societal challenges and maybe his own internalized issues around his bisexuality also really inform that separation of the child self from the adult self. So I felt that was most fitting for his character and was also a way to tell the story and a way to show how the past is inescapable and often mirrors our actions in the present. A lot of what Nick has done in the past are the same mistakes he repeats in the present. And I think that becomes very apparent to that structure.
And I can't say that I really liked Nick for most of this book. And I don't think that at all hinders a reading experience. I think that there are so many moments where I was like, I feel for this man, but I'm also like, you got to get it together. You have to just figure it out, whatever that moment would be. And I think that's for this entire dynamic. I mean, there are maybe redeeming qualities in some of the characters and less so in others, and yet we're watching them interact in such an interesting way. These three men that form the Morrow family. It was so interesting to watch the dynamic, especially the present day dynamic, once you learn more in the past.
Yeah, I definitely have heard from some friends who've read the book that even my dad was like, I was reading it and I just didn't understand what the protagonist was doing what he was doing. He was like, get it together, just like you. I understand that. I think for me, that's what makes a lot of these characters so compelling to write, because they're not all one thing. Like even Carlisle is not just like evil. He has very negative qualities, of course, being racist, being abusive, but deep down, he truly loves his sons. And that is really what his character revolves around, is that he comes from a generation that cannot communicate that love without violence, without abuse, because probably of the way his own father treated him. And so that has profound psychological effects on Nick. And I would say with Nick, I think he is sort of an interesting character because he is obviously clearly victimized child. He has this like just many things that happen to him that are quite terrible, but also he isn't like just because these bad things happen to you doesn't mean that you're necessarily like sympathetic or that you're going to always do the right thing or be a good person. Like he struggles with his trauma in a way that I find to be realistic because he continues to make similar mistakes.
And I think that's something that makes this kind of fiction, whether you want to say speculative or horror or, something beyond the realms of just what we expect and know and recognize as real. Though I think that having those characters that have many layers to them and that you don't always agree with. I mean, I don't think any of us probably want to really read a book where we agree and know and can guess every single thing a character is going to do. I want to be shocked and confused and like have those moments where I go, well, that's not what I would have done. But then it makes you really think, like, how would I respond in these situations, especially as the book goes on and things really start to expand and unfold.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I wrote the book, I at times very strongly identified with Nick. I felt like I really needed to do that. It's my debut novel, so I really wanted a character that I felt I could really tap into and understand his emotions. But then there were other times where, upon rereading after the book has kind of gone on its way to publication, I've been like, well, that was an interesting choice that you made, even though I wrote it and he's not really an independent character for me. But I just think that multifacetedness is really important to me, because when dealing with a lot of these sort of very serious themes of like race, masculinity, generational trauma, things that I wanted to bring out as a bisexual queer person who grew up Asian and was adopted into this type of like farm family, it was something I really wanted to deal with nuance and with respect for the ways that shapes your experience, sometimes for the better and sometimes for the worse. And I didn't want to have just like a stock character. I really wanted to try to draw out the humanity, but also some of the painfulness of those experiences.
And Nick really goes through so many different stages, I think, of where he is at and how he feels. And so much of that comes from the relationships that he has with his father, with his brother, with his brother's wife. But like you just said, this is your debut and it does have a lot of personal connections to you. Mm-hmm. And I wondered how you came to wanting to tell this story and in this way, because you have written before, you've written poetry and other sorts of genres. So I was wondering how you came to this and knew that it was going to be a novel.
Yeah, so I had always wanted to write a novel. I had had a couple abortive attempts that just didn't really work out. And I remember this kind of started with just like an image. And this image is very early in the book, so it's not a spoiler. It's in the first chapter, of a young man driving down a road with his father. And his father, for whatever reason, pushes him out of the car. And the young man has to crawl through the long golden grass, like the grass that I would sometimes see in Nebraska, all the way back to his family's home. And I didn't really know where that was from or what that was going, like where that was going. That stuck with me. And I started to think, well, who are these characters? Like, what are they doing here? Why is the father presumably mad at his son? I'm a very character-driven kind of writer, atmospheric, like mood, the tone, and the sentences are all what really drive me. I'm not so much a plot or structure-driven writer. So for me, building from that scene, I started to think, well, there's this family. There's, the father, the son, and then maybe he's the not favorite son. Maybe there's an older son that has really taken the father's attention away from him. And then that just sort of spiraled into creating the Morrows, I then thought, about setting it in a different location. I knew it needed to be rural. And then I thought, well, there's not, honestly, I don't think a lot of contemporary fiction set directly in Nebraska. And that's where I spent a lot of my time. And I will admit that the location of the farm, not the farm itself, but although some aspects of it are, is based on my family's farm. Like, we have a large Quonset. Our farm is not 1,000 acres, but I sort of blew it up in my imagination to kind of put that on the page. And I really was excited in a way because I think Nebraska itself has its own character within the novel. It's almost like a character in itself in the book. Yeah, I was just really excited to bring that in, to bring in, people of color into the Nebraska narrative and queer people as well. One of our sort of marquee writers from Nebraska, Willa Cather, I believe she was a lesbian. And some people think that perhaps her book, My Ántonia, was written from a male perspective because she couldn't really write, outwardly queer fiction during her time. So I was excited to maybe try to continue some of that like queer rural literature. And then I've always had a love for horror. I love the gothic. I didn't set out to write a horror novel, but that's just sort of how it kind of ended up. And I felt like a giant farmhouse on a 1,000-acre farm in rural Nebraska was a great place to try to do gothic. So that was kind of the swirl of things happening that I kind of put in a blender, and then the book kind of started to come out.
All those pieces together. I mean, when I first saw the book as a, former Midwesterner, I don't know if you can ever really say former. I think once the Midwest
You're
is in you.
always kind of stuck there.
Yeah. I was like, oh, yeah. I mean, I feel like there's always that gothic spookiness to those big farmhouses and those like wide open spaces you can't get to your neighbors.
Yeah, or even just driving around on a back road at night and like looking at those tall like corn stalks that are taller than a human, and there's anything could be in there. It's kind of scary, and there's no noise because you're so far from the city, and the lights are just beautiful because there's no light pollution. The stars are just right above you, but there's so much desolation and there's so much space. It's almost overwhelming.
And the sort of inherent fear of being an outsider in these insular communities, what comes naturally with the idea of, even if there's no outward malice or, an active threat of those things, there's that inherent knowing of, oh, I'm outside of something here, and there is a danger in that. And I think Nick sort of wrestles with that as being someone who's on the line of someone who's inside and outside. He fits in many ways, but also doesn't. And then to watch Amelia, Joshua's wife, come in as well into those communities, there is that inherent sort of danger.
Yeah, there's a sense of danger, a sense of disruption. I remember like I would go visit my grandmother and we would go like have lunch, and then people in the restaurant would like stare because probably just they were curious, but it is just a sense of like, well, this person who doesn't look like the rest of the community has come to town. Like, why is that? And that's something I experienced definitely being transracially adopted into this kind of family. That sense of being part of the family, but also not always being part of the family, and that being manifesting in some very complex ways, which I think is what happens for Nick for sure.
And the idea that even if you try so hard to fit in or to, do the things that he thinks he has to do to get his father's love or the support of the community, he's never really quite able to fully give himself over to that. There are moments where he has the opportunity to sort of do what he thinks he needs to do to fit in, and he's never quite able to fully let himself.
Yes, I think you see that manifest especially in the childhood sections, where I think Nick is very desperate to feel his father's love, and that's what he wants most of all. And I think that's a really central tragedy of the novel, is that his father does love him, but the way it manifests in the dynamic of the family is so tainted by generational abuse and trauma that Carlisle cannot really connect with his sons. And he doesn't see it as abuse himself, but I think he just wants them to quote unquote be men, which is where that like masculinity and that interplay of like homophobia and gender roles come into his character. And so you see Nick and Joshua as adults when they return, and they have this like promise of their father's love dangled before them yet again. They respond in some very interesting ways.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to watch sort of the play in Nick's life of the defense of his father, that even when he's older and he knows, I think, inherently the truth of so many things, he still has that need to like downplay or defend, especially to Amelia. Like, no, it's not like that.
Yeah, for sure.
Especially since we are getting all of this really from Nick's perspective, never quite knowing how much truth is in some of the things he sees and says. Just there's always a sense of, recognizing, oh, I'm seeing this through Nick's eyes, so I don't know what I'd see if I was watching this as an outside perspective.
Yeah, I think that kind of ambiguity in Nick's perspective is definitely really interesting because it, I think, shades the entire novel with like his feelings and his emotions. One of the things that I really wanted to dive into and really was hoping for in the book was to have like a really strong sense of emotional expressiveness and sort of this connection to the character's inner feelings, even if they're maybe wrong or, not accurate to the situation. One of my biggest hobbies is opera singing. And one of the things I love about like opera is like how completely sincere and completely dedicated to evoking some kind of emotional response it is in the audience. And that was sort of what I tried to maybe sort of transfer some of that energy to the book, where there's very much this almost operatic outpouring of Nick's emotions at various points in the novel, where it really goes very deep into what he's feeling and into his wounds.
I think that's especially important in something Midwestern because that is historically the opposite of the Midwestern way. It's a very closed off emotional experience, especially for men, I think. And so to have that insight and that like window into it is really, I think, important in Midwestern fiction.
Yeah, for sure. I think it can be very passive aggressive, the culture. And one thing I wanted to also explore was the way that racism manifests in these insular communities is often not like racial slurs or something really obvious in terms of violence, but it's often more like comments or it's sort of backhanded mentions, like the way that Carlisle says to Amelia when she's cooking American food, "Oh, I didn't know you like our kind of food." These kinds of things that are more subtle and I think very culturally placed in the Midwest.
I'm from Minnesota, and there's this concept of Minnesota nice, and sometimes I have to sit people down that aren't from there and be like, let me tell you what that actually means.
Yeah.
And especially going back to Amelia as a character who is not someone who is able to, I guess, straddle the line between insider and outsider. She, because of her entire existence, she's not able to sort of blend in. Everyone knows who she is immediately. When she walks into any room, like, I think it was so interesting when Nick has to wait for her at the airport and he's like, what does she look like? And I think if it's like, well, you're in Nebraska, I think most likely you'd be able to pick her out. And just that he doesn't like make that connection, I'm like, oh, Nick.
Yeah, I think so. And I think on some level, there's a bit of self-protection there because in an earlier chapter, he has met her at the wedding and he finds her to be very striking. So I think maybe there's some level of like self-denial there that he wouldn't immediately recognize her. And obviously when he sees her, there's a whole description of what she looks like. And I think one of the lines, maybe it was at that section or later in the book, it describes her as young and beautiful as ever, which is, I think, very telling.
And just Nick's, I think, fear of
what
so
that means
much
for him,
yeah, of how he has to go into that situation and him not knowing what will come. And I think there's so much for him of like, he thought he had everything figured out with his family. He thought he knew exactly how it was going to go. And now there's this thing that comes and changes. And it makes him really have to analyze certain things that I think he probably hoped he would never have to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it brings up a lot of thoughts for him on sexuality, on his bisexuality, that I think makes him sort of uncomfortable. I think there's also something to be said about women of color, including Asian women, as a site of desire, but also of fear and the other. And that I think is mixed in with his feelings toward her, where he, on some level, is attracted to her and desires her. And that's very apparent in the first 2 chapters of the meeting. But also he recognizes that she is, for his father, particularly like a symbol of hatred and a symbol of the outside.
And I think what I found also very interesting about the dynamic between Joshua and Amelia is how quickly when Carlisle discovers that they're going to be married, he casts them both out. But when Joshua is willing to come back, if his sin was sort of the sin of leaving and betraying, how quickly that is forgiven versus something that Amelia cannot be forgiven for, which is who she is.
Yeah, it's something he's done, but for her, the sin or the crime lies within her actual existence, her being, which I think is very apparent in the way that Carlisle thinks about people of color.
And I think it goes to what you were saying of it's not necessarily always an extreme reaction, though he had that in the past, and everyone was sort of surprised that it seems he's maybe changed his tone in allowing them back and inviting them back, but sort of that insidious inability to change makes itself very apparent.
Yeah, and there's that ambiguity there in why he invited them back and whether or not if he truly wants to reconcile or does he just want to reestablish control over his children.
And then we expand even further outward, sort of as you were saying, it's Nebraska as a setting, and nature features so heavily in this book. And you've got this sort of dynamic between the very raw and visceral people that we're dealing with, and then their counterparts sort of in the natural world, this raw and visceral world of hunting and fishing and killing and owning the land in certain ways. And we've got foxes and chickens and greyhounds. There's so much of that sort of symbolism as well.
Yeah, I really felt the animal world was completely necessary. I mean, even just thinking back to my memories, being on the farm, we had barn cats. There were different animals running around in the woods. If you just walked in, there'd be just rabbits everywhere. It was so in touch with nature in a way that now living in New York City, I really feel is just completely different. And I felt it was a really potent symbol. Carlisle obviously is the type of man who desires to control, to destroy, and to dominate. And I think the outside world and the world of animals is really no different. He really wants to have control over his entire domain, which is what is exemplified by his behavior with the fox that comes to the farm and starts to eat his chickens, and why he's so enraged by that. So I felt that the animal symbolism was just and even just beyond the symbolism, but the presence of the animals also created I think a counterbalance from this viciousness and cruelty that's going on in the house with the humans. And then the animals, they're sort of a counterweight because animals can also be violent, but they really don't have any intent or meaning behind it. They are just, acting on their instincts. And so I thought it was just sort of an interesting way to explore the human side of violence that is very intergenerational, that can be very traumatic and very complex. And then the more animalistic side of violence, which is sort of driven, I think, more by instinct and by, just animals being animals. And
where those two violences sort of meet when we were talking about hunting or fishing. There are many parts of this book that I was suddenly oh, this feels so much like The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Just that sort of connection to what happens when we as humans go into a natural space and what happens when that natural space sort of creeps back into what we consider our space as humans.
Yeah, and for me, I wanted that natural space to have that vein of Chinese mythology, which, as I mentioned, since I'm Chinese, but also coming from this farm family, I really wanted to draw in some other aspects of my background. And I felt that was a really fertile sort of way to do that because it has that earthiness to it, that sort of mysticalness that you can bring from the woods. And then it brings that into the sort of more quote unquote civilized world of the house. And I found that to be an exciting way to kind of add some speculative elements and then kind of shade the Gothic with something that was not European.
The tension that comes from those scenes where you're balancing, these two worlds essentially, and to watch the characters sort of slip back and forth or be forced back and forth, it really propels the book forward in a way that makes us basically unable to stop reading. I mean, I read most of this book in one sitting because I was I need to know the answers right now.
Well, thank you. I'm glad it was exciting.
I always am just so curious when I start to experience not only, I think it happens a lot in speculative where we get these things that we're not sure about, we don't know about, but then there's also something like you said of a mythology that is beyond the standard Western mythologies that we encounter so often. And I think that really do permeate a lot of speculative and horror fiction, are the exact same things, you know. And not to say that we can't have new and exciting ways to tell those stories, but I think there's really something to be said to expand out and say, right, but there's a whole world of stories that we need to tell.
Yeah, I think for me it was meaningful because I was really writing a book that I felt could finally knit together a lot of my influences and background in a really, hopefully, engaging and interesting way. I mean, being, queer, Chinese adopted, and coming from Nebraska of all places, this is not really the most usual background. And so for me, I just felt really fulfilled and happy to be able to share not only what it was like to be in Nebraska and to be queer, but also to share some aspects of Chinese culture with the reader. And yeah, I guess I hope folks really enjoy that because it was really meaningful for me to put that on the page.
And I think that comes through in the writing. I mean, I think there's something to be said for when a writer puts a lot of themselves into a story, you can feel it, I think, come through, especially like you were saying, in voice of these characters is so important because it's very easy, I think, in writing genre fiction to get so plot heavy and to really depend on the sort of details of that story to move us along. But this is so much about the characters and who they are. And I think that sits more with people as we read through. And I always think I like to try to put as much into a book as I'm getting back. And I think your work really allows us to engage in that way.
Thanks. I'm glad.
And I think it comes to, I know that you've written poetry in the past and other forays into literature. Did you feel any of that when you were writing this? Did you combine any of those like other creative ventures you've had in the past? I know you mentioned opera and music as well. There is always a musicality, I think, to writing prose.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely drew a lot on poetry for sure. That was primarily what I wrote really before embarking on the novel. So I think the prose tends to be pretty poetic and sort of toward that like more imagistic frame. My nonfiction that I wrote about my own background that was like creative nonfiction, I definitely drew on that in the sense of it made me reflect on my time in Nebraska and it made me really reflect on some of the experiences I'd had there. And I wanted to bring them out, but not in an autofiction way. I wanted to transform them with, the made up, the fictional to kind of make something kind of new and exciting with those experiences. Yeah, and opera. I mean, I think that really has some elements in almost all of my work now. I feel like as you mentioned, the musicality of prose is really important to me, sort of the sonic experience of like hearing in your mind's ear when you read, the rhythm of the prose, the sort of the phrasing, the way it climaxes and crescendos and then maybe like drops off. These are all things I've drawn on music for. Yeah, and in particular, I actually just performed this for Pride Month, but there's this piece called Knoxville, Summer of 1915 by Samuel Barber, who was a gay composer, which is why I was performing him for Pride Month. And the text is by James Agee. And it's basically a prose poem that Agee wrote in about 90 minutes. And it's sometimes used as the preface to his book, A Death in the Family. And it's just this beautiful, haunting, nostalgic, and deeply lyrical envisioning of his boyhood in Knoxville. So having to memorize that, having to perform that, those lyrics and words have really stuck with me and have really influenced the way that I try to describe some aspects of Nick's childhood to bring that dreaminess, that nostalgia, that pain and pleasure, the pain that you'll never be that young again, but the pleasure of being, 5 and seeing your dad do fireworks at the 4th of July, trying to pull that into a story as well.
I think that really resonates with some of the things that I think people will come to see when they see Nick, in that sense of, though we don't agree with all the things that he does, and though we don't always connect to him, there is this sense of watching him sort of as a complete person and being like, oh, I understand. I do think that almost all of the characters, when you come to the end, you maybe don't like them or agree with them, but I do think you understand them.
Yeah, I think there's a sense sort of that there's an inexorable kind of pull, that they're all being pulled towards some doom or ill-fated perhaps ending, or that they're all going to be together somehow and joined together in whatever happens to them. And I think that's there in the very first pages, that sort of like doom heavy kind of fatefulness or whatever.
And that's what we love these days, is a good doom heavy book. I don't know. I think there's like, that's one of my best ways to sort of escape into literature, these like speculative horror stories. I know a lot of people would be like, that is crazy, Jenna, what are you talking about? But I think that one, those books really tell us so much about humanity as a whole. And two, I think this sort of genre fiction allows for so much space in who is telling the stories. There is so much great fiction that comes out of non-white voices, queer voices, just sort of those bigger stories in genre fiction.
Yeah, I always enjoy genre fiction for the, I think, freedom it allows you in terms of the speculative. It's very much like you can kind of have almost anything you really want in it if you want to put it in there. And so for me, it felt very natural to blend gothic horror with like Chinese mythology and just see what comes out of the blender, you know? It wasn't like, oh, this will break a rule or like, oh, I need to stick to strict realism, but it was very much like, well, let's throw it in and see what happens.
Do you think you'll keep in sort of a genre fiction space as you go forward, or are you looking sort of into branching into other genres as you write? Or are you just going to open word and see what happens?
Yeah, I have opened word and seen what happens. Right now, sort of TBD. The next project I'm working on also has a lot of similar elements of kind of blending horror with discussing or approaching, let's say, social issues. So my kind of current project that I'm sort of struggling through as one does is more focused on the adoptee experience. So I really wanted to have an adoptee main character, and I also wanted to bring in classical music. So it's sort of a novel about her as a composer who's an adoptee and also a classical composer, slowly losing her sanity as she tries to finish a composition that may or may not be asking quite a bit of her and of her spirit and her soul. So there's some of these elements of like madness and psychological horror, and but also like the classical music piece coming in as well.
I can't wait. That sounds very intriguing. And if it's anything like these characters, I will be there immediately to find out what's going to happen. I have to ask, though, since we are getting ready to have your debut novel out in the world, what are some of your literary influences, whether for this book or just some of your favorites in general?
Oh man, I feel like it would be so hard to name all of them, but I think one of the biggest ones, and I think it's very apparent in Sacrificial Animals in particular, is Cormac McCarthy. He had a really, I think, seismic impact on me when I read The Road in middle school. I was just like completely blown away by the way he uses text, the way he shades every phrase, the just sheer mastery of the way he can manipulate and shape his words, his sentences, his paragraphs, and also the elegance and beauty of it. But also, there's this, I think, a real rawness to it. There's like a real willingness to delve into the violence and like the darker sides of humanity in his work that I find extremely compelling. But there's also, I think, a tenderness and a luminosity to his work. There is a real, I think, especially in The Road, like a real belief in love, that love will save humans, at least save the young boy and the man, and it's really their connection that brings them through that story. So yeah, he's had a huge influence on me for many, many years, and I think that is really apparent in Sacrificial Animals. Some other influences, I mentioned Willa Cather. I think having read her sort of as part of the Nebraska like literary curriculum, she definitely has a presence there as well. My undergraduate degree was in classics, so I read a lot of ancient Greek poetry and drama and literature. Ancient Greek was my specialty. I also read Latin stuff. So I'd say those sort of influenced some of the tone of the novel with that, like, as you mentioned, doom everywhere. That's very Greek. It's very much like this family that's cursed, you know? So that definitely had some influence as well. I just have a real love for literature and translation and ancient literature. Other contemporary authors I've recently been kind of going back to and have been really enjoying Elena Ferrante, the Neapolitan novels. I don't think the influence is so much here in this current book, but maybe in my next ones. I really love the way she depicts the complexities. And as you mentioned, like seeing like Lenu as a whole person and not liking all her choices, but like really creating these characters that are like so real and alive on the page. And then I would also say Marguerite Duras, the lover, showing that relationship that she had with an Asian man, and the complexities of society at that time was really interesting for me to read, but also her approach to memory, how fluid it is, how it's not a novel that is written in sort of a standard chronological sequence, but it moves back and forth and it's very passionate. So I just felt it to be a really interesting experience stylistically and also structurally and formally.
I love that. I can sort of see all those pieces weaving together. I also have a degree in classics, so I think that could be our Doom bond there.
Yeah, doomed Midwestern girlies.
That's it. That's a vibe.
That's a vibe.
I wonder too, since, like you said many times, this is your debut, this is sort of this big thing you're getting ready to put out in the world. Do you have a reader that you would really hope finds this book?
Yeah, I guess I don't have like one specific reader, but I guess I'm hoping for anyone who really enjoys sort of a slower burn horror that really dives into the characters' relationships. And particularly, I feel really happy when I'm able to reach like queer readers, Asian American readers, even adoptee readers or readers who maybe have had that experience, regardless of their background in any way, of being in a family or in a community and not feeling like they belong. I think that's something that many people have experienced. And I guess for me, just folks who maybe also enjoy that mythological aspect. And I think readers who enjoy the like sort of deep relationship building, but then maybe a little bit of, let's say, gore and excitement at the end.
Absolutely. I think all of those readers and more are going to really love Sacrificial Animals when they get their hands on it. So please, Sacrificial Animals is out now. Get your copy and find out all the secrets that we couldn't talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us to talk about this book.
Thank you for having me.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of great books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Sacrificial Animals. I'm Marc at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, and I'm joined by my book buddy Donald in Detroit. Hello, Donald. How are you?
I'm good. Glad to be here once again.
Excellent. I'm going to go ahead and kick things off. I am very excited for people to devour Sacrificial Animals. It is fantastic. It's layered and frightening and deep and beautiful. When I was thinking about the way that Sacrificial Animals blends myth and horror with heritage and family, it brought me back to a book that I love so much, and that is Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a very slim novella that is packed with layers of these themes. And it manages to say so much in so few pages. The quick pitch is it follows a teenage Native American boy whose family has recently moved away from their reservation. And one night he thinks that he sees his father walking through their house. His father has passed away not too long ago. So add in your spooky flavor, you're ready to go. But what happens in his effort to investigate this phenomenon, he unearths these terrible secrets about his own family, about this house and what it can do, and then places himself and his family in a terrible danger. Yes, it's frightening. It is very atmospheric, but it is saying so much more. It is quietly horrifying, but deeply, deeply provocative. The book manages to capture childhood fear in a really delicious and perfect way, but then couples it with cultural touchstones and generational trauma. The way that he speaks to modern day Native American life has always been impressive to me. If you have not read The Only Good Indians, please, for the love of God, do it. I would have recommended that one, but I think I've done that one before, and I can't shut up about that book ever. People kind of tell me to knock it off, but I won't. But Mapping the Interior is just a really perfect way to get into this author's body of work and a way to see what horror can really do sometimes. So please check out Mapping the Interior by Stephen Graham Jones. Donald, what do you have for us today?
It's funny that you mentioned Stephen Graham Jones because I was thinking about mongrels, but decided on a different avenue because I recently read a book that's, relatively new. It's called Gray Dog by Elliot Gish. And the reason why this one spoke to me even more so than mongrels is I think you mentioned it too, like that kind of elevated horror, literary horror. Great Dog just takes it up here, right? You're in a vast landscape of something more than just a traditional horror novel, or even something with that 80s vibe, right? You've got supernatural drama that is panic inducing at some points in the story. Plus, it has to do with animals, right? That's a big theme here with the books we're talking about today. But family drama, literary horror. Plus, one thing I thought was really cool is in Great Dog, the name of the town is Lowly Bridge. And in Sacrificial Animals, it's Stag's Crossing. That just kind of nameplay like that and all kinds of that fun connections that immediately connect books with me. Also, it's Midwestern, so it's kind of isolated and feels lonely. And I think horror works the best when there's that sense of isolation, whether you're stuck in a very small town or even in a big city where even though you're surrounded by tons of people, you can feel really, really lonely. And that sense of loneliness and panic and anxiety is what makes horror books really, really great. And with Grey Dog, that's exactly what you get. You get what movies like Babadook or even like Longlegs now are doing for the books, right? Like Grey Dog is a great pick to read after reading Sacrificial Animals, tying it with Sacrificial Animals. So again, that was Grey Dog by Elliot Gish.
Fantastic. And you're right. I love that you threw in Longlegs as far as like, here's the next benchmark to hit. And I think these authors are really doing something special with horror in a way that people need to be paying more attention, because that means that more of it will come and then we'll be able to read it all. But that's all we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure you give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. I'm Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
You can follow me at BN Fairlane Green.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.